components. Not doing a whole lot with them, but they do at least allow us to simulate the process of signing in and signing out, hiding our notes when they're not there, but it has nothing to do with Firebase. And if you look at the app state, the notes are already loaded, so we're not really protecting them at all. So let's see about actually using these things that we put in base.js related to authentication. We have this auth object. We have this GitHub provider object. Let's look at the Firebase docs. Hopefully this opens in a new tab. It does. Firebase docs. Let's search for auth. Authenticate using GitHub. Not on iOS though. GitHub auth provider, blah, blah, blah. Using JavaScript? Okay. Add Firebase to your JavaScript project, did that. Register your app, did that. Enable GitHub authentication, did that. Okay. Handle the sign-in flow with the Firebase SDK. So we already did this part. Firebase auth, GitHub auth provider. Bunch of other stuff. Okay. Sign in with a pop-up window. Call sign in with pop-up and pass in that provider. And then it looks like, then. We'll deal with that in a second. But there's a function that it'll call when it's finished. To sign in by redirecting to the sign-in page, you can do sign in with redirect. You can also deal directly with OAuth using get redirect result. I like the pop-up idea. That looks easy. So we don't have to call Firebase.auth again. We already did inside base. And we made it a named export called auth. So over in sign-in, how could we import that? So we want to import something from base. But if we said import whatevs from base, what would that actually be importing? The result of rebase create class, right? Because that's the default. So to do a named import, what do? We've done some named imports, but we've never written our own named export. So this is our first time kind of putting those pieces together. Are you raising your hand? Curly brackets, right? So we could say import auth from base, and that'll do it. I think we're going to need that provider too. So GitHub provider here is also a named export. So in sign in, we could import both auth and GitHub auth provider or GitHub provider. So you call sign in with pop-up and you pass in that provider. So what I really want to happen inside this authenticate method is auth, which we imported, dot sign in, and we see some autocomplete stuff. There's all kinds of stuff anonymously, with credential, with custom token. Sign in with pop-up is what we want. And it takes a provider, any of Firebase's auth providers, as its argument. The GitHub provider is the only one we have right now. So we can pass that to sign in with pop-up. And what does that do for us? If you click the button, now, let's unclick on sign in. It's calling authenticate. Oh, I didn't save. Click sign in with GitHub. You should get a pop-up with GitHub asking you to trust this thing with your credentials. So this is that stuff that you put in the app settings in GitHub. This stuff shows up here. So giving it a sensible name and stuff, and you can even give it an icon. isn't a bad idea. And then from there, when you hit authorize, it redirects back to Firebase to let it know that you signed in. That's that thing that we copied and pasted in here. If you click on your GitHub settings, remember we pasted in this callback URL. That way that gets called after you sign in with GitHub so that Firebase knows about it. Okay, now it's not showing me anything, right? Because we didn't do anything with state afterward. But by golly, we signed in with GitHub. If we look in Firebase, under the authentication section, we have sign-in method here that we've been using. If we click on users, now I have one. David@fretless.com, provider, GitHub, created just now with a user ID. So it worked. I did sign in, but we're not doing anything with that information. So the example here shows us calling sign in and then calling then. So this is another way of doing async stuff without regular old callbacks. This is called a promise. Sign in with pop-up returns an object called a promise, which is a relatively new JavaScript feature. It was available through some third-party libraries prior to being implemented in ES6. And it's just a slightly more elegant way to do, and more flexible way to do async stuff. So what happens is, if we call then on the result of sign in with pop-up, .then we can put a function in there to do something with the result. So let's just see what this gives us back. Let's just say data and console log data. So this arrow function here will get called when this finishes, because sign in with pop-up, as you can see, doesn't happen right away. And as you might guess, it does that in the background so that your script continues to execute. It doesn't tie everything up. So it's asynchronous. So let's see what it gives us back. Sign in, pop-up. Now that I've authorized it, it should just happen and move on. Okay, I get back this object, which among other things looks like has a user object in it. The user object has a bunch of stuff, including a name and an email address, and a UID. So this is the unique identifier for my account. You could store the email if you wanted instead of the UID, but I like the idea of the UID. It's also not guessable. So that would be this data object dot user dot UID. And it just so happens that we have a method on app that can receive an object that has a user ID, and it'll store that thing on state. So we could, in sign in, inside this then callback, call auth handler. We're already passing it in, right? And that wants the object that has the user ID. So that could be data.user. Because data.user.uid we saw in the console is something. Let's try that out. Sign in with GitHub. Do the thing. And now I actually see my notes and my sign out button. So we look into React DevTools. UID is now not a hard-coded dstruce, but all this. Sign out, it goes away. Sign in. Yay. Now, the truth is, sign out isn't really unauthenticating us. It's just removing it from state. And since that's what we check. But as far as Firebase is concerned, we're still logged in. So probably sign out ought to do a little bit more. But it's not hard. So in app.js, we already import the default export from base. Let's just add to that our named auth export from base. And then in app, our sign out method, in addition to setting state with the UID back to null, we could call auth.signout, a method built into the Firebase SDK. Now, signout happens to be asynchronous and also returns a promise, just like sign in with popover did, or whatever it was called. So we could call sign out and then call then to be sure that what happens afterward waits until this finishes first. Because if we aren't successful in signing out from Firebase, we probably don't want it to appear that we've signed out. So we'll just move this stuff inside an arrow function. So unlike a callback, this makes it clear that this happens afterward, right? When it's just the second argument to something like set state, without reading the docs, you're not sure what that callback is for, but then kind of makes it clear. Sign out, then do whatever this is. So we're signed out right now. Let's sign in. There's my UID. Sign out. Still seems to happen pretty dang fast. And now we can log in and out. So we've synced our data with Firebase, and now we can even authenticate with Firebase. And it wasn't very hard. Pretty darn easy to work with. Questions about this so far?
Can you go back to app.js? What did you input this for? Besides base, I kind of missed that.
Yeah, so I put a comma and then in brackets, curly braces, auth. Just like we do up here with the reacting component, notice?
Yeah.
We've already done this thing where we, I have a couple semicolons in here, where I import the default and one of the named.
So does this mean that anybody who has access to our app and has a GitHub account can log in, or does it only work if they do the OAuth thing?
They don't need to do what we did in our settings, no. That's just kind of, that's application wide. Yeah. But we can still add rules to only allow certain users if we want to. And we probably should do a little something.